Hello everyone, I'm Iraida Toffrey-Vane and I'm your host for this webinar, which is part of the webinar series of the PCPLD network. Now, thousands of people have watched our webinar so far, and if you're one of them, then welcome back. But if you're new to this series, then you're very welcome. We're delighted to have you here. Now, in previous webinars, we've talked about preparing for the end of life and supporting people with learning disabilities to make the end of life care choices that are right for them. Now, that's all very well and good if you can anticipate that someone is reaching the end of life. But what if the death is less expected? What happens when somebody with learning disability dies and you hadn't really seen it coming? That's what today's webinar is about. It's a huge topic, and we are focused today on the deaths of people with learning disabilities who live in residential care or supported living settings. And I just want to make it clear that we're not talking today about traumatic or avoidable deaths. We know that many families and carers have gone through terrible experiences when things went horribly wrong, and that will be the topic of another webinar in the new year because that's important and it needs proper attention. And we had initially planned to host that in January, but we're now postponing that to a later date, but it's coming and we'll let you know when. So let's look up our speakers for today. Here they are. After their talks, Jane and Hazel are here to answer your questions. So do use the Q&A box for any of your comments, your questions, sharing your own experiences. And we're also live tweeting this webinar. So if you are on Twitter, then do join the conversation using hashtag PCPLD. And it has quickly become a tradition to conclude our webinar on a musical note. And I promise you that today's song by Purple All Stars is really worth staying for. The webinar is recorded. We'll make it available on YouTube. It's going, there'll be a premiere at 5 o'clock English time today. And at the end of the webinar, we'll give you details on how to obtain your certificate of attendance. But now let me introduce today's keynote speaker, and I can't tell you how pleased I am to be able to introduce Professor Jane Bernal. Jane is a doctor and a psychiatrist who worked with people with learning disabilities, and I met Jane at St George's University in London when I first started doing research into end-of-life care and people with learning disabilities. And we've worked together on research, learning about death and dying and learning disability for the past 2 decades. And Jane's perceptiveness and understanding of people's needs and her ability to think through the implications of what we are hearing has really been an inspiration to me. So Jane is now retired, and she has been working still on research, still be involved in it. And in recent years, she's worked with Professor Stuart Todd at the University of South Wales on research into the last few months of life. We are delighted to have.
Hello, Irena, and everybody else who's here at this webinar. I wanted to talk at the webinar because I think that it's important for a network that concerns itself with the end of people's lives to actually think about all deaths, not just the ones that follow a relatively predictable and predicted course. And that isn't always true for people with learning disabilities. And I think it's really important, if we're going to ensure that people have the best quality of life right until the end of life, that we understand the different patterns of dying. People who work in palliative care will know this as dying trajectories. It's a bit of a new word for us in learning disabilities services. And I'd like to move now to my first slide. This, though I was a clinician for many, many years, this isn't primarily a clinical presentation. This is about a very interesting study that we did on the last days of life of people with learning disabilities. And I did that study with colleagues from the University of South Wales and the University of Southampton. And it was paid for by the Baillie Thomas Charitable Fund. Most deaths of people with learning disabilities are relatively unexpected. They're more often sudden or follow a short illness. They're often from illnesses that have run a less predictable course than things like cancer and dementia. So that people themselves, their families, paid support and care staff have less time to prepare for a death. So the care that is given at the end of their lives is their usual care from their families or from the supported living or care services where they live. Their healthcare comes mainly from general practice or from acute hospitals. If we want to understand and improve the care that adults with learning disabilities get at the end of their life, we need to find out a lot more about these less anticipated deaths and to look for patterns in them. And we need to be asking the people who are actually there, who are families, GPs, and in this study, care and support staff. Specialist learning disability and palliative care services won't necessarily be involved at all as these people are dying. I'd particularly like to thank Professor Stuart Todd, as you've heard, and the other members of the research team. So what did we know before we started this research back in 2013-14? We already knew, you all know, sadly, people with learning disabilities die at a younger age than their contemporaries. And we also knew that they don't have equitable access to health services. It's been a concern for palliative care services across Europe that there are too few people with learning disabilities accessing those services. And given the rate of death. So we wanted to know more about the end of people's lives, about how, as well as why they died. And we actually wanted to know, though it's not particularly a feature of this presentation, what the death rate was, because lots of people knew that there was a high death rate, but you can't actually calculate the death rate unless you know the population. So we chose to look at people, adults with learning disabilities who lived in supported living or care homes, specifically for people with learning disabilities. So we didn't look at people who were living on their own. We didn't look at people who were living as most young people with learning disabilities do with their families. And we didn't look at the oldest old people who are often in general care homes for older adults. We wrote to a lot of providers across the UK and we asked them how many living people they supported, and we got about providers who supported about a fifth of the total population of people with learning disabilities. This is a big sample. And we asked them about all deaths over an 18-month period. And we also asked them for contact details for a member of support or care staff who'd known the dead person well. And we sent them a questionnaire incorporating the Voices SF. The Voices SF is a standardized tool that's been widely used to assess the quality of end-of-life services in the whole population. We got 157 questions back, though they sent them back. Some of them didn't answer very many of the questions. And we had 149 that had enough detail for further analysis. Okay, this is the main things, the headline things we found. And I wonder if you'd like to just read them and think whether there's anything there you find surprising. The death rate was 12.2 per 1,000 people supported per year. That is higher than you'd see in the general population, but it isn't that high. What it means is that an individual member of support staff or an individual small care home will see a death perhaps every few years. It isn't something that people have the opportunity necessarily to get lots of experience with, and that's quite different from care homes for older adults. But this is the one that surprised me at the time when we got the data. Only 54 of the 157 staff had been aware for about 3 months or more that the person had an illness that was likely to lead to death. Only 35% of them. And in fact, 50% of the decedents, the people who died, the staff haven't been aware at all that they were dying. So we thought that was worth a further look. These are all the deaths we had enough information on. We asked them how long they'd known, and we also asked how long they'd been ill. So you've got how long they'd been ill across the top and how much it had been anticipated down the side. And what you can see is there are a lot in that top line. There are 83 in the top line that were not anticipated at all. And then there's this group at the bottom right-hand side where deaths have been anticipated for 3 months or so, a month or more. There might have been 6 groups, but in fact there were only 3 people whose deaths were anticipated, but who had a shorter illness. So we are analysing just those 4 groups. And you look at that and you wonder what that was like for those staff telling their stories.
Thank you, Jane. What an important study, and I really want to hear more about the findings. But before we do that, we want to remember that when we're looking at studies like this, it's not just statistics, there are names and people and stories behind those numbers. So we wanted to really listen to a couple of those stories, and I've asked 2 support workers, Hazel and Chloe, to tell us what happened when somebody that they supported and cared really deeply for died. Now, these are not easy stories to tell or easy stories to listen to, so I'm really grateful to both Hazel and Chloe for sharing that with us. Hazel Bradley has worked with a large community for over 40 years with people with learning disabilities, and for the last 24 years she's been in Large in London, where she knew Carol Bell. Carol lived in a home with 5 other people with learning disabilities. She was able to understand and speak sort of in simple words, and she'd become increasingly frail in the last years of her life. Carol died in April last year, 2019, at the age of 68. So here is Hazel.
I'd been traveling and I hadn't been around much. So I felt very out of touch with the news of what was happening in the community that I belonged to, that Carol was part of. And I was quite happily sleeping, I think, when I got a phone call, and it was from a friend of Carol's, no longer living in London, but now in Edinburgh, saying, Carol's in hospital. Can you go and spend the night with her? Because there are only young, new assistants, as we call them, care workers, who don't know her. She needs to have somebody she knows, that she's known for a long time. So I had no idea what was going on. I just thought, well, Carol's in hospital. It felt strange getting a phone call from Edinburgh, and I thought, well, this feels like it's important, I'll go. So I got ready, went down to the hospital, and Carol was in A&E. And there was an assistant who'd been with her there for hours, who looked exhausted, who was really, really good with Carol, a younger woman who'd known her for a short while. I just said, well, do you want me to stay now? And then you can go home and get a break. I'm quite happy to stay the night. So there was a little handover, and I had really no information about what was going on, but there we were in A&E. And Carol was clearly distressed. And she kept trying to get comfortable on the bed. Now, Carol was a little woman. It wasn't like she was big and heavy, but in these hospital beds, trying to work out how to maneuver her to be in a comfortable position was quite difficult. And then she just kept pulling on me. I just have this memory of her saying, Hazel, Hazel, really, really pulling to try and get me to put my arm in the right position to get her comfortable in the bed. And within seconds, the same call. And, it's A&E, people going backwards and forwards, everybody busy. And I kept trying to find somebody who could come and help, but they were all busy. It was really hard to get hold of people to come. And Carol kept wanting a cup of tea, Hazel, cup of tea. And I was getting really worried. The more she drank, the more she'd need to go to the toilet, and that was awkward where she was. And yet if she didn't get it, she was distressed. And so the night just wore on, and I was physically exhausted. Sorry, I feel quite tearful now talking about it. Trying to make her comfortable and do the best, and yet just feeling, I'm in my mid-60s, I just don't have the strength needed for this. And really wanting somebody else around who could give me a bit of background information, who could guide me as to how best to help Carol. So it was exhausting. And I began to, by the early hours of the morning, I could feel myself sort of nodding off by her side. And then afterwards, when I knew that was her last day, I think I felt terrible that I hadn't tried even harder to stay awake. But, just physically, I was at my limit. As the morning dawned, trying to remember the whole sequence, I think we got hold of somebody. That was it. The doctor finally came. Gosh, she didn't even have a proper pillow, now that I think about it. We were trying to roll up a blanket to make her comfortable. I kept thinking, just get her into a hospital bed where she can be comfortable. Anyway, a doctor with a whole group around came. They were learning from him probably. And he said, how did he phrase it? Well, there's nothing more we can do. It's palliative now. That was the word, palliative. And I thought, palliative? Palliative, that's end of life. I was just told she'd come to the hospital. I thought something wasn't right and she just needed help in the hospital. And now we're talking about palliative care. And then the doctors were gone. This is A&E, and I suppose they had any number of people to see. And I remember standing in the corridor, just looking around going, who can I get to help? So I was trying constantly through my mobile to get in touch with the people who were her reference people in the community, so that they were up to date with the situation, knew what to do, knew what was happening. And then I thought, no, I need to let Irena know. Irena welcomed Carol into the community, has known her for years, so she's a close friend. She's a trained nurse, and she knows about situations like this. She needs to know what's happening to her friend. So, of course, that was the other problem, trying to get signal. I didn't want to go too far from Carol, but in a hospital, the signal doesn't always work. It was a nightmare. But I think I finally got hold of Irena, and eventually we were taken into a room for Carol with a proper hospital bed. And by then, thank God, Irena turned up. So I felt I was no longer alone, so I could be with Carol, and Irena went off and talked with the doctors and got the information, came back, and I think she then took time with Carol. And I thought, well, the two of us speaking together said, this, it's not just palliative care, it's clear these are her last hours. We didn't think there was any question of her going to a hospice or going back to the community. She was going to die that day. So at that point, I went out and again tried with the mobile. I thought, I need to let her priest know. And I thought of David Stevenson, who was a priest who knew her really well and had been a real friend and a member of the community. Another priest from the church, Kathy, and Jill O'Neill, another priest who knew Carol well. And I phoned them and we let the community know, and people began to arrive. So Carol was there in bed, being surrounded by the people who she knew, who she loved. People from Gothic Lodge arrived. That's the house where she lived. And Jill arrived. And I think at that point, we really realized it's going to be very, very soon. And Jill was wonderful. She sat right close to Carol and just very gently and very calmly spoke to Carol and prayed with her. And she turned and addressed us. And as she was praying with Carol, the door opened and in came, I think it was Sunta from Gothic Lodge and another of her friends, and some really young new assistants who'd been there less than a year, 19, 20-year-old German assistants. Clearly they'd never encountered death before, and Carol was dying. And as Jill prayed, she came to the end, blessed Carol, said Amen, and Carol died. She took her last breath. I mean, what was wrong with Carol? That was part of the difficulty. You know, I never remember things like that. That's just not part of my brain set. Somebody's not well and the doctor needs to come and help. What I knew that evening was, I think it was something to do with the stomach. Carol was having difficulty eating. I really can't remember the details. What I remember is I had no notion that she would be dying. Absolutely no notion that she was in her last hours. And I think my brain froze at that point. You know, it was just how to keep her comfortable that night. And then the next day, you know, making sure everybody knew and making sure people could be there and that we could be held together as a group. And I suppose that's one of the gifts of Carol. I mean, she was such an amazing, amazing character that people really loved her. You know, she drew people to her. So there we all were gathered around her bed together. When you don't have much medical information yourself, and you need confidence to be able to grab hold of a doctor who's busy running around and around and around dealing with so many people. And yeah, I found that very hard.
That
months.
And we're still feeling the distress.
I'm feeling quite tearful now. It's just that voice, Hazel, you know, the anguish as she was calling out for help. It was all night, all night. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Bless her.
Yeah. Oh, thank you, Hazel. I am so moved by that story. So now let me introduce you to Chloe Paris. Chloe started working in hospitals and care settings 4 years ago when she was 18 years old. And for the past 2 years, she's worked in a supported living service where she's worked with a woman whom we'll call Louise. That's not her real name, it's a pseudonym. Louise had learning disabilities and she was 80 years old when she died in April of this year. Now, again, this is not an easy story to tell or to listen to, so I'm really grateful to you, Chloe, for sharing this with us. Let's listen to what Chloe has to say.
Well, we went into lockdown in March, and I would say it was maybe about 2 weeks into lockdown, 3 weeks into lockdown. It started on day one, and she wasn't eating and she wasn't drinking much, which isn't unusual for her. With her bipolar, she could be like that. But it happened 2 days, 3 days, and I thought, something's not right here. Because, you know, she was a foodie, and even she used to steal people's food, and I would offer her mine. No, didn't want it. So I called the GP. I informed my manager that I don't think something's right, and they wouldn't come out because of coronavirus. So they offered help on the phone, but it wasn't much help at the time because I think they still didn't really understand what was happening. And then it got to, I think it was, day 5 or about day 5, I called again the doctor's surgery, and I said, you need to, come out and assess her. And they said, no, just give it a few more days. And in this time, she still wasn't eating or drinking. She was still her normal self. She was still making her noises and being cheeky, but I knew something wasn't right because I'd known her for so long. I knew something was not on. And then it got to, I think it was like the 6th day, and I said, look, someone needs to come out and see her because I'm worried now. You can't go 6 days without eating and drinking. And so her doctor came out, who was very good. He had been her doctor for a long time and very good with learning disability people. So he saw her and he cancelled all her medication, and I thought, right, this is not good. And so I'm just like, because my mind's kind of blocked out some of it because obviously it's very hard, but he thought it was dementia because it would have been very hard to detect if Louise had dementia or not because of the severe learning disability. But when he said that, I was quite shocked because, you just don't realise. And so he stopped the medication. He said maybe Louise was coming to the end of her life, and that was basically it. And so it got to, I think it was like I was staying with her more, and it got to day like 7 or 8, and she was getting worse. So I called 111. There wasn't much they could do for me, but by this point she wasn't herself. She was very slow. She couldn't walk to the shower. I was having to really help her along to it, and she wasn't going up to the kitchen. She used to open all the cupboards, was her thing, and look in all of them, but she wasn't doing that. And I thought, right, like, I think that what the doctor is saying is possibly right, because I was in denial at first, didn't want to believe it. And the day before she died, I was on one of my late shifts with her, and she had stopped walking completely, and I knew then that she wasn't going to get better. And it wasn't a case of her going into hospital, because if they'd put her on a drip or food for a tube, she wouldn't have understood. She would have just ripped it out, and she was 80 years old. So it wasn't, do you know what I mean? It wasn't as easy as if it was me or you. It wasn't as easy as that. So that night I called 111 again, and I said, look, she's stopped walking. I can't get her out of the bed. I stayed with her till 12 in the morning, and I went home. After 111 called, they said they couldn't do anything. I didn't say goodbye to Louise because she was in bed, she was asleep. And then the next day I was at home, and one of my colleagues called me in like the evening, and they said, Louise has died. And I said, no, she hasn't. What are you on about? That's not even funny. Obviously they wouldn't joke of such a thing, but I was in such denial. And yeah, she had died. So I left home. I got driven up to work. The ambulance was there, the police cars was there, and we were all just mourning, us, the staff. I went to her flat, and some people may think, why did you want to see her pass away, you know, see her body? But that, for me, that was closure. I wanted to be there with her till the end, and I felt really guilty that I was not on shift that day, and that she died when I wasn't there. I wasn't there to look after her. But I went upstairs and I said goodbye to her, and I stayed with her the whole time until she got taken away. So that's basically what happened. And just, I think it was about 9 or 10 days. That's how quickly it happened. It was like a shock, because she wasn't like that. She didn't have any major health problems. She, you know, you just never think of that. And she was 80 years old, but you would never think she was 80 because of just her nature, her cheeky, bubbly personality. But that, it was just shocking. And I kept trying to prepare myself, because I've seen this before from previous places I've worked at, but I didn't want to listen to it, because she had, I know it's not professional, but she had become some part of my family, because I was spending, you know, 5 days a week with her, and she was lovely. So it was really, really difficult times. I couldn't go to work for a week. I was crying every day. I was blaming myself. I just could not, I couldn't pull it together, because I was just so upset by it all. And then it got past a few weeks and stuff, and I planned her funeral. I, you know, arranged all of that, and that kind of gave me a bit of closure, because I knew I'd done something for her, because I wasn't there on the day she died. And obviously, like, still to this day, I blame myself for not being there, even though, you know, I didn't know it was going to happen. I couldn't ask to be on shift that day. So yeah.
How about your colleagues?
Oh, they were all very, very devastated, because they cared for her as well. You know, that you would always see her around in the communal areas. Everyone knew who she was. You would bring her out into town and people would say, oh, hello. They knew her. The colleagues, they were, still to this day, we speak about her. We reminisce on the memories she gave us. But yeah, it's not the same without her. The workplace is not the same. It's, yeah, it definitely affected a lot of people. But I just didn't want to know. So
yeah, it's very difficult. Yeah. And what do you think would have helped you at that time?
To be honest, all my colleagues, and even when she passed away, my managers, they were fantastic about it. My colleagues really helped me, because obviously we worked with her, and they would be on the phone with me, helping me when she passed away. They supported me at the funeral. I couldn't ask for anything more. I had my family as well, who really helped me. So I got so much support, and I'm very lucky, because I know there's probably some people who don't. So like she had become obviously I know you're not allowed to say it, but she had become part of my family, and I couldn't help that because I was spending 5 days with her for like nearly 2 years. It was bound to happen, and you know, I treated her just like I would treat my family, or you know, so.
Thank you so much. It's really important to learn by listening to real stories, and this can't have been easy to talk about. Thank you. Carol's death was sudden. It followed an illness of less than 24 hours, and it sounds as if even 3 days before, neither the other assistants nor anybody else really could have anticipated that Carol was dying. Thank you, Chloe, for sharing a very painful story and for the reminder of the effects of COVID on all this. We were collecting our data in 2014, long before COVID, and people with a short illness and an unanticipated death at that time would probably have been more likely to see a GP or 111 more quickly, and may well have been admitted to hospital. So it's really important to hear these stories. And what I'm doing now is to look at a larger group of people to give a context for these stories. I should explain that neither Chloe nor Hazel, as far as I know, were actually participating in the study, but there may well be people in the audience who did. Right, you've seen this before, but I've put some arrows on to make it clearer what I'm talking about. We've got sudden deaths, or people who were ill for less than 24 hours, on the left-hand side at the top. Then we've got people, perhaps like Louise, who had a shorter illness, but their dying was still not anticipated. And then we've got a group of people who had a relatively long illness, an illness of more than a month, but still were not expected to die, at least not by the care staff, and many of whom hadn't been even as much expected to die as Louise. I mean, it sounds as if Chloe had a pretty shrewd idea, though it hadn't quite been confirmed by anybody else. And then there's this group who died after a long illness in a way that was anticipated. Right, we're just looking at causes of death, and you can see they're actually different across the 4 groups. Cancer and dementia are common in the anticipated dying group, but not in the others. And at the other end of the timing, cardiovascular causes were the most common cause of death in people with sudden death. So that's things like blood clots, which I believe was actually Carol's problem, is that right? Heart attacks, strokes accounted for 40% of the sudden deaths. Respiratory illness was a very common cause of death in all 4 groups. Now, one of the outcomes end-of-life care services like to look at is place of death. Dying at home is seen to be a good thing and an indication of good enough end-of-life care. In this population, dying at home was very strongly associated with anticipated dying. People were able to die at home, and care settings were able to support people to die at home, but that happened when the death was anticipated and perhaps where the course of the last illness was relatively predictable. People who had sudden deaths also often died at home, but that was because they didn't have time to be got anywhere else. People with short illness, unanticipated dying, tended to die in hospital, and people with longer illness, unanticipated dying also. We know that people with learning disabilities don't get the best access to healthcare. Too often their health problems aren't taken seriously until too late. They're not properly investigated. They're not properly treated. So, is hospital admission for people with less expected deaths a measure of better access to appropriate diagnostic and treatment facilities in hospital, or is it a measure of the quality of end-of-life care? It's probably both, but it would be unwise for anybody evaluating services to assume that people dying in hospital are doing so because end-of-life services were inadequate and may still be receiving treatment that they need. I've given you a little bit of numerical data. There's obviously a whole lot more, and it's just been published in the Journal of Applied Research in Intellectual Disabilities. We're going to think about some topics now for discussion. One thing that often comes up is the idea that if deaths are unpredictable, we ought to get better at prediction, that either healthcare professionals or support and care staff ought to be better at predicting. What we heard from the stories today and what we also found in the research is how crucial communication and health advocacy are. And communication is a two-way street, isn't it? Talking, listening, questioning, hearing, and being heard. I think that might be the main thing we need to talk about. Next slide. And I think providers, commissioners, and the people who evaluate services need to be aware that not all deaths will be predictable. And though cancer and dementia follow very predictable trajectories, others don't. And I think we should be talking about that uncertainty.
Thank you very much to all the speakers. It's so much to think about. We've got about 10-15 minutes now for this discussion and questions, and so I'm really pleased that we managed to get Jane here. Hazel is also here. I think for me, you know, what strikes me in this study that you've done, Jane, is that we often have talked a lot about the importance of working together with palliative care services and learning disability services. But what this shows, this study, is that actually in this population, a lot of these deaths don't happen in a very predictable way. And therefore other services like hospitals and acute services have to be probably better prepared to also support this and work together. I'm just wondering whether, I mean, for both Hazel and for Jane, I've got this question, is what do you think, I suppose Hazel, maybe you first, what would have helped you in the hospital? And I'm particularly thinking about the thing you said, Jane, about communication and the importance of communication. So maybe can you say a little bit about that? And I'm sure we haven't got Hazel's picture live here, but she is here on sound.
It would have really helped if a nurse had been able to take time to stop and speak with me. And when the doctor came, that he said more than just, oh, it's now palliative care, and walk away. I needed him to stop and explain more. And certainly throughout the night, that the nurse have more time to be able to talk.
Yeah, I think that's right, because I was there, wasn't I, Hazel, at those final hours, and I wonder the doctors and the hospital staff, they often know a lot more, but they often don't realise, I think, that that we don't know it, that they have to be quite explicit. I mean, Jane, I don't know whether you've got any thoughts on how we can help not just learning disability professionals, but also healthcare professionals to communicate better, what they could do to maybe to improve that.
We've had Catherine Mannix at these webinars before, and she has a really helpful phrase which I think both support and care staff need to have heard, and also doctors and nurses need to know, which is sick enough to die. The people we saw in the study were not, what their illnesses were unpredictable. They were not, there probably wasn't certainty that the person was dying. They couldn't say, she's dying now. The people in the study, it may be that the two we've heard about, well, there was that degree of certainty, but often there isn't. And it's important to say, look, this person is very sick. They're sick enough to die. And it's important also, if the doctor says to a member of support staff something like, well, she's very poorly, or the clotting studies are very unfavourable, or the tumour has progressed, to be able to say, does that mean she's sick enough to die? It isn't an absolute prediction, but it's a really, really helpful idea, that, I think.
Yeah, I think that's right, Jane, because as we've seen, it's not just that the healthcare professionals probably need a bit of help to understand what it is that care staff and families, don't quite understand. But we've also seen how close people are, support workers and staff, to the people they're supporting, and that also makes it much more difficult maybe to see really and to take in, as we can even Chloe, to take in what is happening. So it's not just sort of saying, but it's also hearing it. Yeah, Jane.
Another thing is that doctors, especially hospital doctors, may be quite confused about what the status of that person is who's sitting by the bed. They know perhaps that this person isn't family, and they may think they're a nurse, so that they will understand all this jargon, or they may think that they don't have the right to know for reasons of confidentiality. So there is also something about making sure that hospital staff actually understand that very often their informant is a paid member of staff, yes, but also somebody who is very close to the person and has been close to them for many years often.
Yeah. And before we go over to see what's happening in the Q&A box, Jane, the two situations with Hazel that you talked about and that Chloe talked about, we can probably see a lot of things that maybe we think could have been better. But can you say something about the general sense in your study about how satisfied staff were with the care that was given?
Well, surprisingly, very satisfied indeed. We had expected there to be a lot more criticism of services than there actually was. Now, whether that's because the people who are prepared so bravely to actually come on camera and tell us about their experiences are more likely to be people who've had really pretty terrible experiences, or whether it is the usual thing in research that people tell researchers what they think they want to know. We would actually have been very interested to hear more about not such good experiences, but that wasn't what we heard. One of the things was that the group with the long illnesses who then died unexpectedly, there was slightly less satisfaction in that group, and their pain control wasn't said to be as good. But on the whole, what was surprising to us was that the levels of satisfaction really were relatively high. And I think that's partly because staff weren't quite sure whether they were rating support from outside carers, outside services, or whether they were rating what they themselves had done. Because for the sudden deaths especially, there wasn't really anybody much else.
Great, thanks. Actually, let's go in the last 5 minutes over to Louise Jenkins, who's been looking at the Q&A box behind the scenes. Louise, what's going on? You again have to unmute yourself so that we can hear you.
Hello. Yes. Yeah, I think that there's a lot of questions coming in and themes around mental capacity and best interest decisions. And obviously, you know, with the context of the two cases that we've heard, kind of what those conversations might have been around capacity and the person's right to have a say in what was happening at that point. There's also some themes coming up around support, and obviously people concerned about Hazel and Chloe in terms of what support they've received subsequent to the service users' deaths.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to go over to Hazel then with that question, with both those questions. You know, yeah, Hazel, the kind of support, and Chloe, as I said, she's not here, but she was very clear that she really appreciated the support from her manager. But Hazel, what can you say about support for staff and for carers?
In terms of support, I have to say that Carol and I both belong to a community called L'Arche. So it's a place of work, but it's also a place of friendship and commitment in the long term. So there were lots of people around, and I personally felt very supported. And I think within L'Arche, we are very strong on support for something like that, but it's hugely important. And I think particularly as one of the young people who was only 19 and how much she needed to be able to talk afterwards. So we set up places where people could speak, express what happened, and then really look at how to celebrate Carol's life so that we can grieve properly ourselves, but be held by the group and remember Carol in all the life that she had.
Yeah. I agree with that completely, Hazel, and I'm always, I mean, you know, we're lucky in the L'Arche community that there is such a you know, a community of support, but it is important to remember for everybody, I think, that these are not ordinary care home staff, you know, who go home at the end of the day and forget about their work. As Chloe was saying, that's part of their life. So they're grieving, you know, and I think, you know, we hear about bereavement of people with learning disabilities more, we know about family bereavement, but I think important to remember that staff are also bereaved and they're also grieving. And in terms of mental capacity, I mean, I can only just speak for Carol, I suppose, because I was there. I think, I mean, she really wasn't able to say or indicate or make any decisions, probably at the best of times, but it was the worst of times. And I think quite often at that stage of life, it is quite hard to do that. And I think decisions were made that were right, but then weren't necessarily always communicated with the carers. I don't know, in the last 2 minutes, Jane, do you want to say any final remarks on that? We've got a couple of minutes left. Jane, I'll give you the final word.
Well, we did ask about capacity. I haven't got the figures actually sitting in front of me. Not very many people were thought to have capacity, but what was really interesting was about end-of-life care plans. A lot of people had end-of-life care plans because some people have been ill for really quite a long time. Most of the people, even in some death groups, I think, had an end-of-life care plan, but it was what I'd call a generic one. It wasn't specific to what happened to them. And it was very unusual for the person themselves to have been involved in drawing up that end-of-life care plan. So it isn't just about whether you would have capacity to understand decision, but whether you were involved in the decision making at all, because the Mental Capacity Act requires that, doesn't it?
Yeah. Thank you very much. And I think, I'm afraid that's all we have time for. It's only an hour-long webinar, but I hope this really got you thinking, you know, thinking about the issues. I'm just going to wrap this up now. First, some final announcements. If you would like to receive a certificate of attendance, as usual, please email your full name to info@pcpld.org. And it will really, really help us. Again, we're going to almost begging now for donations, however small. You know, we're a small charity, no source of income, and we really did not rely on donations to be able to keep this webinar series going throughout the next year, which we'd really like to do. And now I'm glad to say that if you're in the UK, you can make it very easy. You can donate by text. And if you're outside the UK, you can't. But if you want to donate more than £20 as well, you can go to our website, and there's different ways of doing it then. Now, I want to say a huge thank you to today's speakers, as Jane Bernal, Hazel Brackley and Chloe Paris, for an illuminating and powerful, and I have to say really moving webinar. And also to Kingston University for their support with hosting the webinar, and especially actually Anastasia, to you, we'd be lost without you. Our next webinar will be on the 9th of February of 2021, and that will focus on supporting people with learning disabilities through bereavement. And we all know how big and important that is, and never more so than during this past difficult years. So there won't be a webinar in January, but really, you know, come to the February one, it's going to be really important. And then finally is the reminder of our new podcast series. So do have a listen. They're about 20 minutes each. That was my final plug. Now, as promised, we are going to finish this webinar with a song. Purple All Stars are a group of people with learning disabilities who performed live for us at our PCPLD Network Conference in Hertfordshire in 2012. They were brilliant then, and they are brilliant now in this lockdown recording. So I hope you enjoy this.
When I am down and oh my soul's so weary, when troubles come and my heart burdened be, then I am still and wait here in the silence until you come and sit a while with me. You raise me up so I can stand on mountains. You raise me up to walk on stormy seas. I am strong when I am on your shoulders. You raise me up to more than I can be. You raise me up so I can stand on mountains. You raise me up to walk on stormy seas. I am strong when I am on your shoulders. You raise me up to more than I can be.
Oh, thank you very much to Purple All Stars. You are all amazing. You've really raised me up here as well. I hope you're all going to have a good enough Christmas. It's not going to be the same as usual, but I hope it's good enough. And we will see you again on the 9th of February. Thank you for joining us.